From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Drabell. I'm a contributing editor of the Washington Post Book World, which is delighted to be once again co-sponsoring the National Book Festival with the Library of Congress. Henry Wiencek and I share a biographical detail. Each of us went to a Jesuit high school in St. Louis and in Boston, respectively, he being the native Bostonian. Whether that background has anything to do with the iconoclastic nature of Wiencek's most recent book, I'm not sure, but iconoclastic it certainly is. I'm talking about Master of the Mountain, which has just come out in paperback. And I don't think I can do any better than to quote my colleague Jonathan Yardley, who placed the book on his best books of 2012 list. So here is his capsule description of the book and the controversy that it set off. Quote, "A fine book that fits no precise category is Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves, Henry Wiencek's devastating picture of the slaveocracy maintained by the author of the Declaration of Independence at his plantations at Monticello and elsewhere. The complexities of race in America have preoccupied Wiencek for years and have now produced 3 exceptional books. The others are The Hairstons, An American Family in Black and White, and An Imperfect God, George Washington, His Slaves, and the Creation of America, of which this may be the best. Wiencek goes beyond the much-told story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings to leave no doubt that given the choice between the economic well-being of his holdings and the rights of the enslaved people who kept them humming, the slaves did not come first. It is not a pretty story, but Wiencek tells it very well. I might add that the Jeffersonian establishment has taken issue, to put it mildly, with Wiencek's take on their man. For The Hairstons, Wiencek won a National Book Critics Circle Award, and for An Imperfect God, he won a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He lives and works as an independent scholar in a place where Thomas Jefferson has a stronger presence than perhaps anywhere but Monticello itself, and that is Charlottesville, Virginia. Please welcome Henry Wiencek.
Thank you very much, Dennis. The Jesuits certainly did have an effect on me, and I think that one of the things that they gave me was something that stood me in good stead doing my George Washington book and Jefferson book, is that to take a careful look at the text. Go back to the original documents, look at them yourself, line by line, word by word, and see what has been left out. See if somebody else who purports to be an expert has twisted, elided, omitted, or in some way distorted what the original says. And that was actually the path that I took in writing the Jefferson book, which turned out to be a very different creature from what I thought it would be. No one wants to write a book that is perceived as iconoclastic about Mr. Jefferson living in Mr. Jefferson's town. But believe me, it's true. I didn't start out wanting to do a book on Jefferson at all. It was suggested to me by a librarian, and I was at a conference in Richmond, and one of the librarians said, you should do a book on Jefferson, because I was talking about all the new information that had turned up when I was writing about George Washington. And it didn't take me but the hour and 10 minutes between Richmond and Charlottesville to decide that I would make that my next project, because there was so much about Jefferson that I didn't understand. I didn't understand, for example, how he could have a mixed-race lover and mixed-race children and then continue to say and do the things that he did to black people. I didn't understand the so-called paradox about him, that on the one hand he could write the Declaration of Independence and then continue to hold slaves. But at the time, I was content to let it stay at that stage of paradox. everybody said that he was a man of contradictions and a man of great complexities. And I knew all of the major historians at UVA and Monticello who had spent their lives and careers studying Jefferson. I'd lived in Monticello since 1992. And I fully accepted their view of Jefferson, that he was a very highly moral and very conflicted man on the subject of slavery, that he yearns to throw it off, but he could not, because he was hampered by his terrible burdensome debts, and he was also hampered by a primitive racism that was typical of many 18th century people. He simply thought that black people were inferior and that he could never throw off this idea. And also that he was hampered by political considerations, but that on the other side of all that, he treated his slaves very well, and he yearns to find an opportunity somehow to free them. Well, I spent about 2 years researching and writing a book that was really very much along those lines when things began to fall apart. As the Jesuits had taught me, I spent a lot of time looking at the original documents, some of which are at the Library of Congress and were available online on the internet. And what I began to find really disturbed me. For one thing, one of the first things I found was a document that showed that the regime at Monticello was not as benevolent and as kind as we had been led to believe. That I found a note about the young boys being whipped to get them to work in Mr. Jefferson's nail factory at the top of the mountain. Now, this line had been deliberately omitted when that letter was first published in 1953 by Monticello, and in an edition prepared by a UVA editor. When it was initially published, the last line was just 3 dots. No one is being whipped, ... Well, when the full text was published in 2005, it turned out to say no one is being whipped except the small ones. Now, this changes the meaning of the letter 100%. No one's being whipped except the children to get them to work. And the head historian at Monticello, who has been basing all of her research on this letter, did not know that until I mentioned it in a public talk in Charlottesville. And I discovered that much of the writing about Jefferson's regime was based on this one letter, which was sanitized. But what really shook my thinking about Jefferson and brought me into very sharp conflict with the Jefferson establishment was my discovery of two letters that were actually in plain sight. They weren't something they weren't items that were buried in boxes somewhere and had to be dug out. They had been published. They should have been known. They should have been written about, but they weren't. In one of them, in the 1790s, early 1790s, Jefferson was writing a profit and loss memo about his plantation to George Washington, of all people, who was laying plans to free his slaves. And Jefferson said that the increase in the slave population was part of the profit. He said, "I allow nothing for losses by death, but I will take credit 4% per annum for their increase in keeping up their own numbers." Now, this was an extraordinary formula. I hadn't seen anyone else state this so bluntly. He was literally counting the babies at Monticello and calculating how much they increased every year, and he put it down in the profit column of the plantation. And at first I thought, well, this might just be an outlier. Maybe it doesn't really mean what I think it means. But 2 years later, he wrote a letter to a neighboring family and said, if you've got any money, invest it in slaves. He was advancing the idea of slavery as the strategic investment strategy of the future. He said slave property increases from 5 to 10% a year. He called it the silent profit. And I began to see in Jefferson's thinking something that George Washington had railed against. It was this notion of turning people into money. Because once you turn a person into money, into a commodity, you can do anything. You turn them into a non-being. And Jefferson had done that, and it coincided in the 1790s with a marked decline in his statements about emancipation. Because the young Jefferson had been a very, very fiery emancipator. In the 1760s, he proposed an emancipation bill that failed to get passed in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote a political manifesto calling for the enfranchisement of the slaves in Virginia. Now, enfranchisement is a legal term that means to give the rights of citizenship to. This was in 1774, in the run-up to the Revolution. If we had actually done something like that, it would have changed our history. Now, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, just 2 years after he talked about enfranchisement, and wrote that all men are created equal, I fully believe that he meant to include African Americans in that formula, and other scholars believe it as well. It's interesting to note that when the constitutions of 6 southern states were written based on the Declaration, they had to change the language. They didn't say all men are created equal, they said all free men are created equal, because they knew what Jefferson meant, and they didn't want to see that carried into effect in their own borders. So we see a couple of different Jeffersons. We see a young Jefferson who was a fiery emancipator, and in the 1790s we see as revolutionary rhetoric and revolutionary idealism begins to go downhill, that a different Jefferson takes command. And this really reflects the thinking throughout the South and in many portions of the North. There were strong feelings during the Revolution that we might actually begin to see an emancipation movement. George Washington so thoroughly integrated the United States Army during the Revolution that one member of Congress said that he was laying the basis for the emancipation of slaves in America. Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson and Washington's aide, John Lawrence, called for freeing 5,000 slaves in Georgia and South Carolina and giving them their freedom with their muskets. Unfortunately, this plan went nowhere. But after the war, there was tremendous pressure on people like Washington and Jefferson to free their slaves. George Washington at first demurred, but then he began to lay plans in secret to free his slaves. He tried to get the financing together by selling land out west, but he couldn't find a buyer, and that plan went away. During his presidency, he was appalled to find that one of his in-laws was taking 5-year-old girls, 6-year-old girls, 8-year-old girls, and selling them on the open market not far from here in what was then just called the Federal City. He tried to get some of those slaves back, and he railed against when another one of his relatives talked about selling slaves, he railed against turning people into cattle in the marketplace. And finally, in his will, he did free his slaves. So Jefferson likewise came under a lot of pressure from a lot of people. Even people in his own family freed slaves. His cousin Richard Randolph freed all of his slaves and gave them land. But Jefferson mysteriously always backed off. And as one scholar has said, Joyce Appleby, the more power he had to do something about slavery, the less he actually did about it. And the reason, I think, is because he was finding slavery so profitable. And we can see this at Monticello, and we can see the processes at Monticello being repeated all across the South. One of the most interesting of those processes was a shift from planting tobacco to planting wheat. And I can just hear you thinking, this guy's going to talk agriculture to us now for 5 minutes? This has got to be one of the most boring things we've ever been hit with. But it is crucial to understanding the early history, or the history of slavery at a very crucial time. Because lots of planters in this part of the South were shifting to wheat. It required a whole different kind of workforce. It required people who had a great variety of skills. Wagon builders, wagon drivers, wheelwrights, plowmen, men and women who could build machinery, repair machinery, operate machinery. They required a whole different set of skills. And an enslaved workforce that had only been asked to do very, very basic things before that, working in a field under an overseer raising tobacco, was suddenly called upon in a few short years to learn a whole range of skills that were very technical and very, very profitable. Jefferson's workforce, like many of the other workforces across the Chesapeake area, responded with amazing rapidity and showed themselves to be highly amenable to education and training. If you look at the Monticello website under employment, you'll find that there were some 26 different skills that Jefferson's people acquired in the mid-1790s. Now, when Jefferson had been in France, he told the French, I would love to free slaves. I would love to train them and set them free, but they're stupid. They're like children. They can't plan. Well, a few years later, one of his French friends came over to visit Monticello when Jefferson had finished the transition from planting tobacco to planting wheat, and he was amazed at all the professions that were held at Monticello. He said that his Negroes, as he called them, were cabinet makers, shoemakers, harvesters, that they performed every sort of task on the plantation. And so then he began to talk to Mr. Jefferson about the possibility of emancipation. Well, look at it was a miracle what had been achieved. Isn't this now the time to free the slaves? And Jefferson said, no, you don't understand. We have a much deeper problem. It's called race. These people are very dark-skinned, and if we set them free, they will mingle with us white people, and the race will be ruined. Now, the Frenchmen and other French who had come to visit could look around and see that this bore no relationship to reality whatsoever, because Jefferson's household was already staffed with very light-skinned people, some of whom were so fair that you couldn't even tell that they had any trace of African blood. So this is an example of a new era that we were getting into, where slaveholders had the power, a peculiar species of power, to declare what was real and what was not. So a visitor could look upon the faces of slaves who were almost white, and a master would say, well, they're not white, they're black. And we can't let the mixing of the races happen. So it was an extreme form of power at its most unfettered, and the slaveholders enjoyed it throughout the slavery period, and it's an example of just what they could do. They could bend reality and make people believe that, exactly what they said was true just because they had the power to say it. Now, their power over slaves was absolute. They had power over their families. They had power over where they lived, what they ate, what they wore, where they worked. There's a lot of talk now at public history sites about the agency of the slaves, how slaves could seize hold of certain patterns of life, that they could choose to worship or not to, that they could choose their spousal partners, that they could resist the masters in fighting back at work, in slowing down, in pretending to be sick, in stealing things. Maybe so. But all of this affected slavery merely at the margins. The master always remained firmly in control. And one of the things that he even tried to control, and Jefferson shows us this very vividly, is the mind of the slave. As Benjamin Franklin, of all people, wrote, the one thing that a slave really owns is his goodwill, and he can bestow that wherever he or she wants to. But that goodwill can be purchased at a very cheap price. A few encouraging words, a little bit of good treatment, and you will grab that goodwill, the control of that goodwill, away from the slave. And suddenly life gets much easier on a plantation. Thomas Jefferson tried to do that. He said, well, I'm going to motivate my people as much as possible with rewards and incentives. But these rewards were paltry. He had a magnificent cabinet maker, one of the members of the Hemings family, John Hemings. Jefferson said that this man made some of the finest woodwork to be seen in the United States. Jefferson gave him an incentive. Do you know what it was? $20 a year. Jefferson, in his own records, said that he paid Johnny Hemings $20 a year, which he admitted was 1 month's salary for a year's work, which I give him as an encouragement. And he paid tips, or gratuities as he called them, to a few other of his special household slaves. But some of his slaves could earn a small amount of money by doing extra work, by doing extra charcoal burning and making extra barrels, that sort of thing. But it was never enough to get them out of slavery. It was never enough to win the master's confidence to an extent that he would let you go. There was one slave who did use his opportunities, a man named James Hubbard, to buy clothing and to buy free papers, and he managed to escape. He did it twice, and both times Jefferson had him hunted down, and the second time he was sold. And we don't really know what happened to him. The thing about politically about Jefferson and slavery is that we can see in his career two bookend events that show how much he had changed. In 1784, when he was still in his young emancipator phase, he was a member of the Continental Congress, and he proposed a radical bit of legislation. He said essentially he was drawing a bright line along the western border of the then existing United States. And he said, if we ever acquire any new territories beyond that line, we will only allow slaves in there until 1800. So essentially he was putting a timeline on slavery, or a deadline. He said, if we ever have it now, it's going to end in 1800. Flash forward to 1803. What is one of Jefferson's greatest achievements? The purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Congress decides that it would put severe restrictions on slavery because it was generally recognized that the purchase of Louisiana represented a test for the United States. Are we going to expand slavery, or are we going to curtail it, as we've been saying that we want to? There was tremendous pressure from Southern slaveholders to introduce slavery into Louisiana. And they were the ones who had the largest available workforce, and they had ready access to cash and credit to go in and emigrate in what they called a torrent of emigration. But Congress proposed something interesting. Well, it would be familiar with us from the settlement of the West. They proposed that we break up this territory into small holdings, 160, 200 acres, and open it up for small farmers. Jefferson's friend, Thomas Paine, he of the one who wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote an impassioned letter to the president, his old revolutionary friend, begging Jefferson not to send people into Louisiana in what he called a state of wretchedness and slavery. He said, this is the chance to put into practice a plan which you yourself, President Jefferson, have talked about. We will send freed people into Louisiana with 2 years of money for training. We'll give them some land to work on. We'll put them side by side with white farmers, teach them self-reliance and independence, and after 2 or 3 years, they will be ready to take their place as free citizens. What did Jefferson do? He sent a message to his floor manager in the Senate: slaves to be admitted to the territory. He had changed entirely from the man he was just 20 years before. The interesting thing is that it never occurred to him to do what he had proposed in 1784, set a timeline, a deadline on slavery. Why not put a deadline of 20, 25, 30 years on slavery in Louisiana? It would have changed our history, but he didn't do that. We would have slavery there indefinitely. One of the primary effects of that was that it opened a vast internal market to the slave trade. President Jefferson in 1807 signed the enabling legislation that ended the international slave trade. But what that did immediately was to raise the value of every slave then living in the United States of America. Jefferson understood this, the slave owners understood it. And when he opened Louisiana to slavery, he opened a vast, vast market for the domestic slave trade. And it became something like what we think of today as the NASDAQ. It was an active secondary market in people with prices fluctuating up and down. I first learned about the effect of this when I was writing my book on George Washington, when the Quakers came to the first Congress and proposed an emancipation law. It drove the market insane. President Washington got a letter from one of his slaveholding relatives saying, "What are you doing? The market has collapsed. People are selling slaves for a song because they think that Congress is going to do something to force the emancipation of slaves." He spoke about it exactly the way a financial advisor would speak to the president today, saying, "You're driving the NASDAQ crazy. Stop talking about this particular piece of legislation." So I began to see that this market in slaves was just like our modern stock market. And interestingly enough, much of the research that's going on now in the history of slavery is more market-based and economic-based. We're seeing it as something that was crucial to the burgeoning growth of the South and the United States. When Jefferson was our minister to France, he carried over there a figure in his head, $30 million. That was the value of our tobacco exports every year to France. And most of that, as you know, was raised by slaves. As I mentioned, Jefferson, throughout his life, receives appeals from various emancipators, from various old friends of the Revolution, who begged him to do something about slavery. One of the most powerful appeals came from his old revolutionary friend, Thaddeus Kosciuszko. And when I put this in the book, this particularly enraged the Jeffersonian scholars because they had really managed to bury it. There was no mention of it at all in any in any part of the Monticello website, and none of the Jefferson scholars had ever written about it. People outside the Jefferson community had. I first learned about Kosciuszko's relationship with Jefferson when I was in Philadelphia, and I stopped at Kosciuszko's house, which has been restored, and I found a pamphlet that said that Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who served as a military engineer under George Washington during the Revolution, had left a will with some almost $20,000 that he left to Jefferson to free Jefferson's slaves. Now, I'd lived in Charlottesville for 20 years, or at that time about 15 years, and I never heard it. So I looked up the documents about it, and lo and behold, it was true. In 1798, I think, or 7, when Kosciuszko was leaving the United States, he sat down with Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia and wrote out a will in which he said, I want you to take my money when I die and use as much of it as possible to free as many slaves as you want to free at Monticello, and provide them with land and livestock to set them up as free people. Now, when Kosciuszko died some 20 years later, Jefferson was presented with this will. Now, this gave him exactly the opportunity to do what he had been saying that he would do. He said at least 4 times that he would make any sacrifice, any at all, to personally advance the cause of emancipation. Well, this man, Kosciuszko, put $20,000 on the table that would give Jefferson whatever compensation he wanted for slaves, for as many slaves as he wanted to sell, and it would enable Jefferson to satisfy a new Virginia law that forced emancipators to send slaves out of the state. He could have bought them land in Illinois, in Ohio, or anywhere he wanted. Jefferson walked away from it. He didn't do it. And I wondered, why didn't he do it? Well, the people who were most qualified under the terms of the will would be Jefferson's most valuable slaves. Would he sell Johnny Hemings, his world-class, his national leading, joiner and cabinet maker? No. Hemings could read and write. He could support himself, but Jefferson's not going to give him up. Would Jefferson let his cooks go? No. His cooks were trained in the White House. He had 2 women who were trained as teenagers in the White House by his French professional chefs. Their husbands were, one of them was the top blacksmith, a very valuable man, and the other was the top wagon driver at Monticello. Jefferson was not going to give them up. So you go down the roster and you find that everybody who is ready to get freedom and to do well is just too valuable. So Jefferson walks away from this money. Now the Jeffersonian, the scholars will say, well, eventually the will was found to be invalid. Yes, but Jefferson never knew that. That judgment was made in the 1850s. When it first went to court, the will was found to be valid, and the administrator went to Jefferson and said, "You've got a second shot at this." And Jefferson, "Yeah, I know. This will is valid. It's gonna stand up, but I don't want to carry it out." And the interesting thing is that after Jefferson died, his grandson tried to get that money to keep the slaves that Jefferson died owning off the auction block. But the administrator said, "Well, the money's in the bank, but it's too late. You really can't touch it anymore." And one of the unfortunate results of Jefferson's public policies and private policies was seen from Monticello by his daughter after his death. She said, "The country is overrun with those traffickers in human blood, the Negro buyers." And she regretted that her dear Virginia had been turned into one big market, and so did her son. But that was one of the results of Jefferson's decisions about the Louisiana Purchase, and it was the result of what you do when you turn people into money. Now, I'm going to stop there so that we have about 15 minutes for questions. So, thank you very much. And if you have a question, please step to the microphone. Ma'am, I think you were first.
Isn't it true that by the time of Jefferson's death, his slaves, which were considered chattel property, were mortgaged and he couldn't have set them free if he wanted to? And
go ahead.
And with regard to Sally Hemings, that she was a Randolph reportedly the half-sister of his wife. And although he did not set her children free by law, he did not hunt them down when they slipped away.
That's right. He allowed her children to go. She wasn't a Randolph, she was a Wales. She was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha. You make an interesting, your question about the mortgaging of slaves is very interesting, because if you ever visited Monticello, the building that you see was built with a slave equity loan. In the 1790s, Jefferson had gotten his debt under control, and he decided that he could take on more debt to expand, and he wanted to rebuild Monticello, and also he needed to finance his shift to wheat. So he wrote to a banking house in Amsterdam that he had done business with and said, would you take 150 American slaves as collateral for a loan? And they said they would. So he wrote out the documents and sent the title over to Amsterdam, and they opened a line of credit for him, an equity line, in humans for $2,000 at a merchant house in Philadelphia. And it was that money that Jefferson drew upon to build Monticello. And that was my point about the Kosciuszko will, because Kosciuszko offered him $20,000 that Jefferson could have used to pay off part of the debt that was constraining, that he said was constraining him from freeing slaves. Jefferson left that money on the table because the slaves were so valuable. And I want to address the question of debt. Jefferson's debt has been greatly exaggerated. Here's a man who complained about debt his whole life, but he built Monticello twice, and then when he decided he needed more space, he built yet another mansion called Poplar Forest in Lynchburg, and then he spent $30,000 building a mill and canal at the foot of Monticello Mountain in the early 1800s. And if he had not spent that $30,000, which was more than a year of his presidential salary, he would have had that money to do what he always said he wanted to do, to free slaves. But Jefferson's debt never stopped him from doing anything that he wanted to do. But, okay, Miss?
Yeah, my question is about the speed with which he changed from apparently sincerely believing that slaves should be free and given a chance in life, and the opposite. Do you have any feeling about what caused his change so quickly?
There were a couple of things. I think one of his changes in attitude had to do, I think, with race itself and with racial mixing. He began, in the 1770s and in the 80s, he was talking about freeing slaves, but also in the 80s, he began to talk about the impossibility of freeing slaves because of the mixing of blood. And I think that his feeling against the mixing of blood grew stronger after his wife died, because picking up what this previous questioner asked, the Hemingses were related to Jefferson through his wife, and that blood connection by marriage, the blood and marriage connection, gave them a claim over Jefferson that I don't think he ever really liked. And after his wife died, then he lost his personal connection to those slaves, but they still had a claim on him. And I think that he always resented that, and that was one of the reasons that he stood so strongly against racial mixing. The other, I think, was economic, is that holding on to slaves increased his own economic power, and he saw it as an economic bulwark for his beloved South, and especially for Virginia. As long as the South had slaves, it could stand up to the economic power of the North. So, yes.
Yes. At American History, they had an exhibit on Monticello and the slavery there.
Yes.
And one of the boards there had said that when he died, he had freed his valet for his honorable and 45, 50 years of service.
Right.
And then, but he sold off this man's wife and children. And so that always haunted me. And I was wondering if you know what happened to this poor guy's, his master frees him but sells off his wife and kids. So was he ever able to get his wife and family back? I
don't know. The valet was Burl Colbert. I don't know. No, Burl's wife died, actually. What you're thinking about is the person you're thinking about is Joseph Fawcett. Fawcett was Jefferson's blacksmith. And Jefferson freed him in his will, but he left his wife Edith and their 7 or 8 children still enslaved. And they were sold to, I forget, 6 or 7 different buyers. And it was really a terrible tragedy for the Fawcett family. One of the daughters ran off right away and disappeared. And I opened the book with the story of one of his sons, Peter Fawcett, who ran away twice and was both times brought back in handcuffs and sold in this. And at one point he said that he was determined to get free or die. And his story is so powerful that I tell it at the beginning of the book. Yes, sir.
In their long correspondence, did John Adams and Thomas Jefferson ever discuss Jefferson's slaves?
No, to my knowledge, they didn't. And Adams took a hands-off approach. During the Revolution and later on the slavery question, like many Northerners, he said, "Let's leave this to the Southerners. I don't want to deal with this." He came up in an interesting way during the Revolution because there was a proposal to arm African Americans in New Jersey to form a home guard during the Revolution, and John Adams opposed it, not because he didn't want it, because he said South Carolina will be thrown out of its wits if we do this. And it was an interesting example of the most extreme element, that is the South Carolina planters setting national policy because somebody elsewhere was afraid of how they would react. But yes, sir.
Yes, enjoyed both of your books very much on Washington and Jefferson.
Thank you. Thank you.
Question I had is relative to the paradoxes, as you said, between all men are created equal and him engaging in such extensive human bondage. Isn't this true of all of Jefferson's life? I mean, he was against a centralized government, then does the Louisiana Purchase. He says, I am not opposing Adams, and yet he's supporting the newspaper war.
Right.
I've seen this over and over again with Jefferson, and my question to you is, why do you think you've received such strong criticism for somebody who has got so many character flaws?
I think in part because my book runs counter to the public history presentation that we're seeing now at Monticello. And Monticello has done fabulous research. I mean, Cinder Stanton has spent years resurrecting the lives of the slaves from complete obscurity. And they have done an excellent job presenting the way of life of the slaves up there. But I don't think that they have crossed the final line. They can see that the slaves were highly intelligent, amenable to training, very accomplished. And yet they never challenge in their interpretation Jefferson himself. They never say, okay, why did you continue to say that these people were stupid and like children and incompetent and useless? And my answer is, it's because they're profitable. Well, Monticello doesn't like to hear that. I mean, they sort of want to keep everything in that state of paradox. And that's what that Jefferson exhibit was here at the Smithsonian. It said Paradox of Liberty. That's an approach that I reject. I think it's a refusal to come to a judgment. So, yes.
My question was about that, the criticism of your work by scholars who are not apologists for Jefferson. The New York Times ran a piece about your book in which they quoted scholars who you cite in your work, like Annette Gordon-Reed, who is very unhappy with how you portrayed her work in your scholarship. And I actually met Miss Reed recently and asked her about that. Mm-hmm. And she said she's very unhappy. She feels like you're distorting her work and that you have gone further than other historians in criticizing Jefferson. And again, these are scholars very well respected who are not apologists for Jefferson.
Oh, she sure is. Of course she's an apologist for Jefferson.
Absolutely not.
Well, no, I quoted her at one point, not in the...
Well, they feel like you're distorting their work. How do you respond to that?
Well, I know that I'm not distorting her work because all I did is I quoted it verbatim. She is the one who said that Jefferson, quote, devised a kinder, gentler slavery at Monticello. That's in her book, The Hemingses of Monticello. It's not true. It's a fabrication. But it's what they want to believe. I think that her interpretation of the relationship between Sally Hemings, I believe that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. I think that's true. Annette and I are in agreement on that. I don't think that they had a warm, loving relationship, as Jefferson implies. The document, and this is not just my opinion, I'm following the text. I'm following what their son, Madison Hemings, said in his 1873 newspaper interview. He referred to his mother as Jefferson's concubine, which is a very harsh word to use of one's mother. He said that Jefferson all but ignored him and his siblings. Annette doesn't. She says, well, he says that Jefferson was not in the habit of displaying any affection toward us, and Annette says, well, it doesn't mean never. And then she uses that tiny opening to project the idea that they had quality time together at Jefferson's Poplar Forest plantation, and that he was a loving and a doting father. Well, there's no evidence for it. It's a fantasy. And because I go after that view, I don't specifically go after her, I go after that view, they're very unhappy. So, but anyway.
Yeah, that was my question, so I'll ask another one.
Yeah.
Now I've forgotten what it was. I'm just curious to know how Jefferson could be so against racial mixing when he was like the chief racial mixer of North America.
Well, that was one of the questions that I set out to explain. Yeah, thank you for that question. And that was one of the things I was going to put under the umbrella of paradox. But I began to see that this is really a story about power. When you have total power over a whole class of people, you can do whatever you want, and you can get away with it. And there were a couple of UVA professors who visited Monticello, and they commented obliquely on this fact that there were so many people at Monticello who resembled Jefferson. And they said that he was held in such an awe and such veneration, those were their words, that you would never think of bringing it up. So, I mean, and that's the kind of power he had. He could distort reality. People could look at things and not process it. We refuse to see this. So, anyway.
My question for you is, if Jefferson was so opposed to slavery when he was a younger man, when and how did he acquire his slaves in the first place? And if he was still young, why didn't he just set them free immediately? That's
a very good question. The Revolution really changed everything, and Jefferson began talking about freeing slaves in the run-up to the Revolution in the 1760s, and he said that the ending of the slave trade would be a condition of that. He said that he implied that it wouldn't make any sense to free slaves then if we're still importing slaves. That's why he called for an end to the slave trade. But that really is that's a very good question. He acquired most of his slaves by inheritance from his own parents and from his wife's parents, and then the slaves increased, as I mentioned, at a rate of about 4% a year, and an extraordinary number of people were born into his ownership in the 1780s and 90s. He had such a surplus of slaves that he was able to sell and give away, I forget, 165 slaves or something like that. We only have time for one more question. Over here. Okay, yes, ma'am.
I have a question about his personal views on slavery and what he did and how he thought about the black man, and what the pressures of the time and political pressures who he represented in the United States government. Do you, in your book, separate what politically he could or could not have done, because he did represent the southern states more than anything at one point,
right,
and his personal decisions whether he could free or not free the slave? I understand your criticism of him not doing it personally, but does your book put him in the historical time in which he lived and whom he represented, and what repercussions he would have suffered had he gone out and been for emancipation?
Right. I will give you an answer quickly. I try to judge Jefferson by the standards of his time and his contemporaries, not me. He came under tremendous pressure from people who told him that he was the author of the Declaration. He's the leader of democracy in this country. He is the apostle of liberty. You, Mr. Jefferson, should free your slaves. Other people in his time and place in Virginia did free their slaves, and he didn't. As to what Jefferson thought about black people, we really don't know. Well, what I talk about in the book is that what he wrote and what he said is completely at odds with the reality on the mountain. That when he was, as I've said a couple of times, when he said that black people were incompetent like children, they were extremely skilled and very valuable people. So, but it's impossible to get inside his head. But go ahead.
I think it's unfair to say that everyone around him would have been for him to do this, because
Not everyone. No.
But
He would have certainly would have
you're
run into
saying
trouble.
that people would have been. I would argue that knowing a little bit about the history of that period, there were too many people who had too much to lose to have supported the idea of emancipation in general.
Right. Okay. Well, you know what? I've been signaled that we're off now. So thank you very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.